In this edition of Life Stories, we meet a truly inspirational woman who over 7 years of her childhood witnessed the very worst kind of cruelty and misery imaginable. In fact, as Mindu Hornick says, there are no words to describe Auschwitz. Today, Mindu is the only survivor of Auschwitz that lives in the Midlands. Mindu's story is powerful, harrowing and almost unbelievable, but it's a story that has to be told. Well, thank you very much, Mindu, for coming into the studio to tell us all about your incredible story. I think it's worth saying, just to start off with, that we did first meet socially some 30 years ago, and at that point,
yes.
I didn't know that you were a survivor of the Holocaust. But I was told a few years later, but it was then another few years when you were somehow prompted to start telling your story in schools.
To start talking about it, yes.
What was the defining moment that made you decide that?
Well, we realized that it is important to tell our story, that hopefully it will never happen again. It was absolute paramount that we start telling. And then education groups started forming from the Association of Jewish Refugees. And they gave lessons to people to talk, because a lot of people couldn't talk about it. It was too painful for us to share our stories.
So for all those years after you were liberated, you just tightened up?
Just tightened up, and we didn't talk about it, no. Not.
Well, more about that later, but let's go back to 1929, when you were born in what was then called Czechoslovakia.
Slovakia, yes.
That's right. Your earliest memories, tell us about your earliest memories.
Well, we had a lovely home. What I can remember, we were a family of four, two young brothers and an older sister. And we had, it was a rural part of Slovakia. We had a lovely home with an orchard. And we had good relations with our neighbors, our Slovak neighbors, and with our school friends. But unfortunately, once the Germans started persecuting the Jews, it all changed.
But before
we
that, talk about the German and the Nazis,
that, yes.
Your childhood as a toddler and as a young girl, I mean, presumably you played in the orchard, you played games.
We played in the orchard, we played games. I remember us having, what they call it, at the end of the season, we had the bonfires, baking potatoes in it, making jams in copper kettles outside with the whole neighborhood. And we were a religious family. The family life meant a lot. Like the festivals were always well observed. And we had a small synagogue, which we used because we were a small community, but surrounding areas would come and join our synagogue.
So we're in the
it was a lovely life.
A lovely life in, say, the mid-30s.
Yes, in the mid-30s.
And you were
a
going
lovely
to
life.
school.
And we went to school.
And presumably families, whether it be Jewish or other faiths, they knew each other and they were friends.
We knew each other, and it made no difference. We were on good relations with all our friends.
So the 30s is moving on.
Yes.
As a child, I was trying to think about this before you came in today, is that there was no internet in those days, obviously. There was no television.
No.
Probably limited radio, or radio was playing music.
Yeah, mainly music.
Were you aware as a child that the winds of change were coming in all over Europe?
Not really.
No.
Not really. Not really till about 1941. 1940, when we heard that our family in Prague were taken to a transit camp in Theresienstadt, where all the Czech Jews went. But we could feel tension. We as children weren't told anything. Everything was kept secret from us. And as we have established, we didn't have internet, we didn't have any television, so we weren't very well informed, no.
And your parents behaved normally?
They behaved normally till my father was recruited to the so-called army.
Well,
But-
why do you say so-called army?
Because these men weren't given uniforms. They had a normal suit, with just the Star of David. And they were sent ahead of the German armadas to dig their trenches, unload their lorries, to do all their menial tasks. And that's where really we started feeling the terrible stress. All my father's business was confiscated.
What business was it?
He was a wood and hay merchant. They were the woods there that were being used all over the world for furniture. And in those days, there was no animal food. The hay was being cut when it was green and fresh, and put into bales. And there was special special works to tie these bales, and they were selling them to the farmers.
So, I mean, I'm just
Yeah.
picking up this
Yes.
picture of almost an idyllic life in the mid-30s.
It
and
is
you've already
absolutely
mentioned
idyllic, yes.
that Hitler's doing his deals in different
Yes,
parts of
yes.
Central Europe,
Yes.
and your father is called up into the army, but it's menial work. He's not really a soldier.
It's not a soldier. He's the
it's
one getting a
free
uniform.
labour,
Free labour,
basically.
yes.
Yeah.
Because the Germans always got the underdog to do the menial tasks. They didn't do it.
The next thing is there's a knock on the door, and it's
Yes.
off to the ghetto.
Yes, the ghetto. Well, our town, the small community, there was about 35 families, was cleared out, including my grandparents, some other relations and neighbors, Jewish neighbors, except for about 10 or 12 of the families that the husbands were in the military, what I was telling you, so-called army. For some reason, the Hungarian president, who collaborated with the Germans, insisted that these families are being left at home. But it was very hard for my mother. We had no money coming in. I mean, how she managed to feed 4 of us, I don't really, I can't imagine. But she must have been very resourceful, which I know she was.
So you go to this nearby town,
Yes.
you're in a ghetto. Just briefly tell us about your daily routine. I mean, did you still go to school?
We still went to school. They gave that part of Slovakia to the Hungarians. I told you this Hungarian president insisted that these families would stay at home. They imported Hungarian teachers, and we went to Hungarian school. The Slovaks could please themselves, but we as Jewish children were to please the authorities. We immediately went to Hungarian school. So for my sins, I still speak Hungarian.
So the ghetto.
Yeah.
The next horrible
then,
incident
yes.
is the
Yes.
being marched to a train, cattle trucks, and an horrendous journey
Yeah.
to a destination. You didn't know the destination.
First of all, we were taken into the town center, taken onto lorries, and taken to a ghetto. For 6 or 8 weeks we were there. They would section off a part of the city. Again, it was very rural. If I remember correctly, we lived on a hayloft. There was my mother with a little bit of food she bought with my little brothers, and there were lots of other families there. We lived in a hayloft. And we were there for about 6 weeks, and then suddenly, again, we were rounded up like cattle, taken onto railway sidings and put into cattle wagons.
And I know, because you've
Yes,
told me
yeah,
on a
yeah,
previous
yeah.
occasion that you spent 3 incredibly horrible, miserable, cold nights, days and nights,
Days and nights,
travelling
yeah,
to this
yes,
unknown destination.
quite.
And then you open, and then the cattle truck is open, the doors to the cattle truck are
Yes.
open. And did you know you were in Auschwitz?
No, we had no idea where we were being taken. We had nothing. I mean, once, to describe to you a little bit of the horror, once we were taken into these carriages, We were left in darkness, and we hadn't got a clue
Mindu,
where we were going.
what we'll do,
Yeah.
because this is the next
Yes, section.
part of this incredible story,
Uh-huh.
we'll take a break now
Yeah.
and we'll come back and
Yes.
we'll look at the next part
Yes.
of
Okay.
your
Okay.
journey and life story.
Yes. Okay.
On Life Stories today, we're talking to Mindu Hornick, the only known Holocaust survivor living in the Midlands. So, when the cattle truck doors opened,
Yeah.
there was a defining moment, wasn't there?
That was a defining moment. Well, there was panic. There was shock and panic, and there were the SS men walking around, barking dogs viciously, and loudspeakers. Whether it was disorientators, I don't know. But on this cattle truck, when it opened, one of these capos, which were in striped clothing, a Polish man jumped onto the carriage. And as we were by the door, I told you, he said to my mother in Yiddish, "Which are your children?" My mother said, "Well, these are my girls and these are my two little boys." He said, "Why don't you let these girls go ahead? Let them go ahead, you will see them later." The fact, I think, that he spoke to her in a language, in a Yiddish language, she thought it was the right thing to do. You can imagine the confusion and the panic. So she turned to us and she said to us, "Do as this man says. Go ahead, I'll see you later." From then on, we were separated from our mother and our children, which we didn't know, our little brothers, which we didn't know at the time. Anyway, as he was helping us down, because these carriages were very high, to scramble down the carriage, he said to me, "You say you're 17, and you, to my sister, you say you're 19.
And you were 13 at this
Yes,
point, weren't you?
yes.
It's 1942, you're
Yes,
13.
I was 13, but he said, "Tell them you are 17, your sister," she said she was 2 years older, "you are 19, and du bist a Schneiderin," means you are a seamstress. And go ahead. And he really urged us. So we joined this enormous trail of people. And we got to the top of that queue. We realized, we reached the famous gate, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. There was a selection. There were...
Is that in your memory? You saw that?
Yeah, we saw
sign,
that, and we
Arbeit
saw this,
macht frei, yeah.
this we saw this gate, and there was selection. Mothers and children were pushed to the left, and older people. The most of the train consisted of just mothers and children. They collected the dregs of that area. And then we were guided through, were allowed into the main camp. In all honesty, Mike, I cannot remember if we were asked our age, but later on, they had 90% of records. The records were there, because years later we were entitled to a pension, and I couldn't remember anything. And they said, we don't worry. The solicitors came back within 6 weeks. He said, "We've got all your records." But I cannot remember them asking. You can imagine the shock and the disorientation. You didn't know where you were.
Just
a kid.
A child, weren't you? Yeah.
So once we went through this famous gate, I mean, the sight, well, I'll never forget it. It'll stay with me for the rest of life.
It's all right. Okay.
Yeah. There were corpses everywhere. Corpses everywhere. There was this terrible smell and grey ash all around. There were watchtowers with soldiers pointing machine guns at us. And they were yelling at us to form into fives to march. They were obsessed with people standing into a row of five and marching. Now, what did we know about marching?
Were you able to stay with your sister at this
Oh,
point?
we were able to stay with my sister, yes.
Eva?
Yeah, Eva. Oh, yes. We held on to each other tight,
Yes.
and we stayed. A lot of people survived the camp. They lived for each other in pairs because people lived for each other. Anyway, so into rows of five, and the minute they got us together, they started marching us. And they marched us to the shower rooms to be deloused. We had to be stripped naked, our hair shaven. There were men around with rough scissors just cutting our hairs off. And then when we'd finished, they threw us just one of these striped and some wooden clogs. They bought all of Holland, from Holland, all these wooden clogs.
This is all on the same night?
On the same day. And then we were taken what is called a block, where we would be housed, which usually held 1,000 people. And there were bunk beds of 3 tiers in each square, which was only a little bit bigger than this, would hold 8 people. But that night, by the time we arrived, it was night. They were all occupied, the beds. There was no room for us to go on one of these bunks. So we had to sit up on the stone floor all night without any water.
What month was it? Was it cold? Or?
No, it was June.
Oh, so
it wasn't too bad. We had no water to drink or to wash, no sanitation, and people were dying. Typhoid was rampant. It was everywhere.
Tell us, Minda, about a normal day. Just you get up. Was there any food in the morning?
No, there wasn't. They would give us a cup of soup at lunchtime, which was made of turnips, tasteless. It was slimy, tasteless soup. Like in one dish, like a trough, and you would all have several had to drink out of that. But that soup was also laced with some kind of chemical, I think bromide, to dull our senses.
To dull the senses, yeah.
And to stop all women's bodily functions.
Right.
Yeah.
I know that you spent time in Auschwitz and then you were moved to a slave labour camp.
Yes, we were selected to a slave labour camp.
And that was slightly different.
Slightly better because they needed us for work. I mean, once you were chosen out of the death camp Auschwitz with the crematoriums around you, you possibly had a chance of survival, particularly if you were working. So 500 women, again, we were taken to a big hall, 10 times the size of this, stripped naked again. I mean, at any time, the humiliation. We were making bombs and grenades. It was a factory outside. I must tell you, this factory was incredible. It was outside Bremen, underground, in a wood. So the Allies were looking because they knew their ammunition coming out, but they couldn't find us. Then suddenly, late May, they put us on a passenger train, the first time on a passenger train. But either side of the train, they still put up machine guns.
Tell us briefly about the liberation. Yeah.
Well, the liberation, after our train was bombed by the Allies, not knowing that there were concentration camps, we were walked to the port of Lübeck. And they set us on a hill, still wanted to load us on a truck, sending us to hand us over to the Red Cross. But by some miracle we decided we couldn't move. We had sick and wounded girls. And suddenly dusk fell and our Lagerführer came, the head of our camp, and he said, you are going to be free and we are going to go into captivity. And we sat there terrified. We were in hostile area. And only 2 days later did we see a tank and a couple of outriders and a jeep going by, and they were the Americans, because they were deep in Germany.
Army.
The US Army who liberated us. And they were fantastic. They set up a school. They took over a school and set up a medical unit for all the sick and wounded girls. And they started looking after us. And after a month or so, they took us to the Baltic Sea to recuperate, because we were all very weak and very hungry and a lot of wounded girls from the train bombing.
Mindu, what a powerful, powerful story. And as we said at the beginning, it's a story that has to be told. So you talked us through your childhood, the ghetto, Auschwitz, the labour camp, and then I know that you recuperated by the Baltic, you went to Prague, you came to England, you met your future husband, and you have 2 fine daughters, and so there was time then to heal as much as you can. Have you got a final message you'd like to tell us?
Yes, I have. We hope that our existence, despite our history, proves the failure of attempts to eradicate our people, and that we can both contribute to making the world a better place in which our descendants can live happily.